A cocky, ruthless biker stormed into the diner, arrogant and utterly convinced that no one would dare stand in his way. He insulted the waitress like it was second nature, spread in fear as if he ruled over everyone. But tonight he picked the wrong place and the wrong person to mess with, because in the corner of the diner, Big Shaq was watching, and when he made his move, arrogance would crumble. What happens when a bully meets an immovable force? Watch now, and leave a comment on where you're watching from. Do not forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you will not miss thrilling stories like this. Outside, rain lashed against the diner's windows, droplets trailing down like tears on the foggy glass. The flicker and neon sign above the entrance buzzed, weakly struggling to stay lit in the storm. The heavy downpour drummed against the rooftop, accompanied by gusts of wind, howling through the cracks in the door, wrapping the place in a dense, chilling mist. The door swung open, letting in a powerful gust that rattled the tiny bell hanging above. But the door had not been thrown open in a rush. It simply yielded to the presence of someone too large to go unnoticed. Shaquille O'Neal ducked slightly to avoid hitting the door frame, then stepped inside. His towering frame dominated the space, making the wooden chairs and small tables seem almost toy-like. In comparison, the already cramped diner seemed to shrink further under the presence of a man standing over 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad like a fortress, and hands that could easily palm a basketball, with a single grip under the diner's dim, golden light. Shaq's sharp gaze swept across the room, an old habit he never quite shook. He always noticed the little details, and something here was not right. Behind the counter, a young woman, with dark curly hair, neatly tied back with a faded brown hair tie, wiped down the counter with an old rag. Her uniform was simple, slightly worn from long shifts. The name tag pinned to her chest read Lauren. She moved with the practiced motions of someone used to exhaustion, but it was not her tiredness that caught Shaq's attention. It was the thinly veiled worry in her deep, brown eyes. Shaq stepped forward, pulled out a chair, and sat down. The chair let out a soft creak under his weight. Lauren looked up momentarily, surprised by the sheer size of the man before her. She quickly regained her composure, offering a polite but wary smile. "Hey there, what can I get for you?" "Double burger, fries, and a hot coffee," Shaq replied, his voice deep and steady, like distant thunder rolling through the night. Lauren nodded, but her fingers tightened slightly around the pen in her hand as she wrote down the order, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. But Shaq noticed she was afraid of something. As she turned toward the kitchen, Shaq took the opportunity to scan the room more carefully. The diner was not busy. A few truck drivers sat in the far corner, sipping coffee in silence, deliberately avoiding eye contact. Near the window, an older man read a newspaper, but his eyes were not on the pages. Every so often he glanced toward the door, expecting something or fearing it. Shaq's brow furrowed slightly. Then Lauren returned from the kitchen, but instead of heading straight toward him, she glanced at the entrance just for a second. But it was enough. Not everyone reacts that way. Only people who live with fear, people who have been forced into a state of constant vigilance, have that kind of reflex. And that was Shaq's first real sign that something was about to happen. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind howling against the diner's windows. But the real storm had yet to begin. Outside, the rain continued to pour relentlessly, each drop striking the window pane like the frantic notes of a symphony, forewarning something ominous. The wind howled through the cracks, carrying a biting chill that seeped into the already cramped and dimly lit diner, making it feel even more isolated. Yet the coldness of nature was nothing compared to the frigid aura that swept in the moment the door was flung open. With brute force, the bell above the door clanged sharply, no longer the familiar gentle chime, but a jarring blade-like sound, slicing through the thick tension in the air. The door had been pushed open so violently that the wind surged inside, dragging with it a wave of icy mist that made the candle flames on the tables flicker precariously. A few stray menace lifted into the air before fluttering down lost and directionless. Rick and his gang stepped in, each of them carrying a weight so palpable it could be felt the second they entered. The room fell into an eerie silence, as if some invisible force had just swept through, suffocating all sound. The black leather jackets they wore were worn and stained, their arms and necks marked with intricate tattoos that told stories of past violence. Heavy boots thudded against the wooden floor in steady, deliberate steps, imprinting their presence like a branding iron, pressing into old splintering wood. Rick was not the kind of man who needed to boast his strength with cheap threats or reckless actions. He did not need to shout to draw attention or establish dominance. He knew full well that his mere presence was enough to create undeniable shift in power. He was tall, his muscular frame sculpted not in a gym, but through countless street brawls. His face bore the scars of a life, carved out in violence, each line and mark a testament to battles fought and won. His eyes were devoid of warmth, hollow and predatory like those of a beast that had long abandoned the need for conscience. Following behind him were 4 men, each exuding a different brand of danger. To his left was a man nicknamed Snaggletooth, a wary figure with a perpetually crooked grin, exposing a chipped front tooth, an old souvenir from past fights. He was thin, but his eyes darted around with sharp, predatory cunning, like a scavenger waiting for an opportunity to strike. Next to him was a tall, lean man with a tattoo of a coiling snake wrapped around his neck, inked in such a way that it seemed to move whenever he did. He was the quietest of the group, but also the most dangerous. His cold, calculating stare cut deeper than words ever could. Closest to Rick was a hulking, bald man, his arms thick with muscle and wrapped in layers of ink, his sheer size alone a silent threat. The last of the group had a mop of unkempt hair, a perpetual smirk tugging at his lips. But it was the kind of smile that carried a quiet, simmering menace, making him perhaps the most unpredictable of them all. As soon as the gang entered, the entire atmosphere of the diner seemed to contract, not physically but in an invisible, suffocating way, as if the walls themselves were closing in under the oppressive weight of their presence. The customers, who had been engaged in casual conversation and meals just moments ago, fell silent. Not a single head turned, but the tension in their shoulders betrayed their unease. An elderly man near the window, who had been reading a newspaper, lowered it slightly, not to leave but to shrink into himself, hoping to appear small and unnoticed. Across the room a trucker lifted his coffee cup, but his hands trembled, just enough for the liquid inside to ripple, dangerously close to spilling over. Behind the counter, Lauren tightened her grip around the tray she was holding, her knuckles turning white from the pressure. She did not need to turn around to know who had just walked in. Her breath came slightly heavier, but she forced herself to remain composed. Rick did not bother scanning the room or assessing the people inside. He did not have to. He walked straight to the counter with an air of entitlement, not as a customer, but as if he owned the place, as if he were here to collect what was rightfully his. Without a word, he slammed his palm down onto the counter, with a force that made the entire diner jolt. The impact sent a nearby coffee cup trembling, the dark liquid inside sloshing over the rim. He leaned in slightly, his scarred lips twisting into a smirk that stretched unpleasantly. "All right, sweetheart," he drawled, voice low but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Time to pay up." His tone was not loud, but it carried something far worse. An unshackable, inescapable authority. It was not a request, it was not even a demand. It was a command. Lauren remained still, but from across the room, Shaq, sitting quietly in his usual corner, could see the tension in her posture, the way her fingers gripped the edge of the counter, with a force that turned her knuckles bone white. She did not answer right away, because she knew the moment she spoke, things would escalate. She had two choices: bow her head, comply as she had before, hand over the money just to keep the fragile peace, or refuse, stand her ground, face the consequences of defiance, knowing full well that the storm it would bring down on her might be more than she could handle. She did not need to look at Shaquille O'Neal to know he was watching, silent and unmoving, but keenly aware of every second that passed. Lauren took a slow, steady breath, forcing down the tremor in her chest, and then she clenched her fist. Tonight she was not going to back down. The atmosphere in the diner thickened, as if every molecule of air had frozen. The moment Lauren opened her mouth, the slow, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock echoed through the small room. Yet no one paid attention to the time. All eyes were locked onto a single point. The petite waitress standing behind the counter, facing the most dangerous man in town. Lauren clenched her fists, refusing to back down. Her voice was not loud, but each word she spoke carried the weight of unshakable resolve, ringing out like a declaration of war. In a place ruled by fear, "I already told you, I'm not paying you." A simple sentence. Yet, in this context, it was like striking a match in a room filled with gasoline. It did not take long. A burst of laughter erupted from one of Rick's lackeys. Sharp and mocking, it was gap-toothed. His grin always crooked, his eyes constantly darting. Like a vulture circling a carcass, he folded his arms, tilting his head as he regarded Lauren, his lips twisting into a sneer. "You always say that," he drawled, his voice thick and sluggish like mud. "And yet in the end you always give in." There was smug certainty in his tone, the confidence of a man who had watched too many people bow, break, and surrender. He glanced at Rick, expecting the usual scene to play out. Lauren lowering her gaze, trembling hands, reaching into her apron for the hard-earned cash she scraped together from endless hours of exhausting work. But today was different. Lauren stood her ground, fingers digging into the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white. She did not reach for her wallet. She did not divert her gaze. The fear that once dulled her eyes was gone, replaced by something sharp, unyielding. Something in the air shifted. Shaquille O'Neal, who had been silently observing from the corner, lowered his coffee cup. The ceramic met the wooden table with a soft, deliberate clink, a small sound. Yet it rippled through the room like a warning bell. His eyes never left them. There was no rush, no flurry of movement, no visible anger. Just a steady, calculating gaze, assessing every twitch, every breath of the men in front of him. Rick noticed the look, but he did not care. He was not the type to be intimidated by a mere stare, not even from Shaquille O'Neal, not even from a man towering over 7 feet tall, whose hands could crush a basketball with a single squeeze. Rick stepped forward. The space between him and Lauren shrank to nothing but a breath. His hand shot out, fingers clamping around her wrist, like a steel vice. The pressure was immediate, brutal. Lauren winced as pain shot through her arm. But she bit down hard on her lip, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Rick's smirk deepened as he leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper, meant only for her. "I think you forgot how things work around here, little girl." His grip tightened, intent clear. This was not just about money anymore. This was a lesson, a reminder, a punishment for defiance. But before he could press harder, before he could make her regret standing up to him, a massive hand closed around his wrist. Rick froze. Not from pain, at least not yet, but from sheer shock. The pressure was immediate, suffocating, like an iron clamp locking down on his bones. Blood flow choked off in an instant. His fingers, once so sure and dominant, suddenly felt powerless. He did not need to turn to know who it was. Shaquille O'Neal. The towering man's eyes held no anger, no tension, just an unwavering, ice-cold certainty. His grip was not tight enough to break Rick's wrist. Not yet, but it was more than enough to send a message. The contrast in their sizes became painfully clear. Rick was no small man, but beside Shaq, he might as well have been a child, caught in the grip of a giant. Rick instinctively tried to jerk his arm free. He could not. Shaq did not move. He did not even strain his fingers, simply held firm. A silent but undeniable statement. "You are not in control here." The diner fell into a suffocating silence. Even the sound of rain tapping against the windows seemed distant, drowned out by the weight of the moment. Rick's crew stood motionless, their expressions frozen, as if they had just witnessed something impossible. Lauren exhaled slowly, but she did not step back. She knew this was not over. The real storm had only just begun. The air inside the diner grew thick, as if every molecule was being compressed by an invisible force. Lauren stood frozen, her fingers clenched so tightly that her knuckles turned white. But now her eyes held more than just fear. There was shock, a deep, raw astonishment at what had just unfolded. The one thing she never dared to imagine had happened. Rick, the man who had terrified her for months, had been stopped with a single hand. Shaquille O'Neal remained seated in his chair, yet the power radiating from his arm completely overpowered Rick. His massive hand engulfed the thug's wrist, effortlessly restraining him. Despite Rick's frantic struggles, the muscles beneath Shaq's black t-shirt tensed slightly, not from exertion, but simply because the difference in strength was that vast. Rick froze, a sharp pain shooting up his arm from his wrist. Instinctively he tried yanking his arm free, but it would not budge. He realized in an instant that he was not in control of this fight. This was not like dealing with some two-bit cop in town. This was not like roughing up a helpless debtor. This was not even like the brawls he'd had with other gang members. This was something else entirely. The absolute difference between real power and cheap bravado. The diner remained eerily silent. The patrons exchanged nervous glances. Some held their breath. Others opened their mouths, as if to say something, only to shut them just as quickly. No one wanted to draw attention. One of the bikers standing behind Rick swallowed hard, then muttered just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "Holy shit, that's Shaquille O'Neal." This time there was no mockery in his voice, no arrogance. Rick's twisted smirk remained, but there was a flicker of something new in his eyes, something only the perceptive could catch. He was no longer as smug as when he first walked in, no longer carrying himself as if he controlled the entire room. He was beginning to realize he was stuck. That the man sitting before him was unlike anyone he had ever faced. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, then forced out a chuckle, though this time it sounded far more strained. So what if you're big? You think just 'cause you're good at basketball, you can fight? He tried to sound casual, to keep his voice from shaking, but the entire room could feel the uncertainty creeping into his tone. No one responded. His men did not step forward. Not one of them seemed eager to challenge. The man sitting before them, Gaptooth, the biker who had mocked Lauren earlier, had stopped smiling long ago. The tall, lanky guy with the snake tattoo on his neck no longer looked indifferent. His eyes flickered toward the exit, as if weighing the odds of just walking away. But Rick could not back down. Not in front of his crew, not in front of Lauren, and especially not in front of a man whose strength he had not even begun to understand. His fists tightened. The muscles in his arm flexed as he stepped forward, leaning in, putting every ounce of his weight into his punch. I do not care who the fuck you are, but if you think you can get in my way, I'll make you regret it. The words barely left his mouth before his fist shot forward, aimed straight for Shaq's face. A punch fueled by anger, by pride, by the desperate need to assert dominance. But it never landed. Shaq did not move, did not flinch, just watched as if he had already seen it coming. At the last possible moment, he tilted his head slightly, allowing Rick's punch to whistle past his cheek, striking nothing but empty air. And before Rick could even process what had happened, a massive hand clamped onto his shoulder. Then, with the suddenness that defied belief, he was lifted off the ground. Every person in the diner watched in stunned silence. Rick, the man who had terrorized this town, was dangling in the air like a rag doll. His feet no longer touched the floor. Gravity no longer anchored him. He thrashed, but the hand gripping his shoulder was unyielding, immovable. His breath came in short, panicked bursts. Every last ounce of confidence had drained from his face. Shaq gazed at him, not with anger, not with amusement, just a quiet, deadly calm. This was not a fight. This was judgment. His voice was low, steady, carrying a weight Rick had never felt before. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. And then, without warning, Shaq hurled him across the diner. The impact was thunderous. Rick's body slammed into a nearby table with a deafening crash. Plates, glasses, silverware, everything shattered on impact. He groaned, his body spasming from the sheer force. But before he could recover, another hand seized his collar, and then once more he was airborne. This time the table beneath him snapped in half. The diner fell into absolute silence. Lauren's eyes were wide, her fingers still gripping the counter, not out of fear anymore, but pure shock at what she had just witnessed. No one spoke. Rick, the man who had terrorized so many, now lay sprawled on the floor, gasping for breath, his face pale with sheer terror. Shaq stood tall, unshaken, unbothered, not even winded. His voice cut through the silence like a final verdict. Get out now. The sound of Rick's body slamming onto the table still echoed in the air, a brutal warning bell. Though not everyone was wise enough to heed it. He lay sprawled on the floor, his breathing ragged, eyes wide in shock. Pain throbbed through his chest, a relentless reminder of his downfall. But his pride would not allow him to let this end here. He knew that if he walked away now, everything he had built, his reputation, his dominance would crumble. He could not let his crew see him weak. He could not let the weaklings in this diner think they could ever stand against him. His pale blue eyes burned with a feral intensity. The look of a man pushed to the edge. A man with nothing left to lose. Gritting his teeth, he pushed himself up, wiping the blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. His gaze swept over his gang, who stood frozen in shock. "Take him down." The words were not shouted, yet they carried a weight that snapped his men out of their stupor. For a brief moment, hesitation flickered across a few faces, but instinct, the kind honed by violence, quickly took over at Rick's nod. They surged forward, surrounding Shaq from all angles, forming a tight circle, like a pack of wolves closing in on their prey. But they had made a fatal mistake. They thought Shaquille O'Neal was the prey. The first to move was a bald thug, with tattoos covering his arms. He charged at Shaq, launching a punch with the force of a sledgehammer. But in a blink, Shaq tilted his head ever so slightly, letting the fist slice through empty air. Before the man could react, Shaq struck a straight punch to the chest. He did not even need to put his full strength into it, yet it was enough. The man's body jerked backward, as if hit by a freight train. His back crashed into a table, the wood groaning under his weight, before he crumpled to the floor unconscious, mouth agape in sheer shock. For a heartbeat, the others hesitated. Then one of them decided to act before thinking. He lunged from behind, leaping onto Shaq's back, locking his arms around the giant's neck, in a desperate attempt to choke him out. Mistake number 2. Shaq did not even budge. With nothing more than a casual reach over his shoulder, his massive fingers clamped around the smaller man, prying him off like peeling a sticker. In one smooth motion, he yanked the guy off his back, spun and hurled him onto the floor, with enough force to make the wooden boards quake. Beneath the impact, the gang started to realize they were in serious trouble. But fear was not enough to stop them. Another one snatched up a wooden chair, gripping it tightly, before swinging it down onto Shaq's back, with all the strength he could muster. The chair shattered instantly. Shaq did not flinch, he did not even turn around. The attacker stood frozen, still clutching the broken chair legs, his expression morphing from aggression to horror. As realization dawned, Shaq had not even acknowledged the hit. And then came the sound, a sharp, sickening crack, not from Shaq, from the man's wrist. Shaq's enormous hand had closed around it, his grip tightening with terrifying ease. The thug dropped to his knees, a strangled gasp escaping his throat, as pain flooded his senses. Panic set in, they could not touch him. No punch could take him down. No weapon could make him fall. And one by one the so-called tough guys hit the floor. Some unconscious, some writhing in pain. Others scrambling to get away from the unstoppable force. Standing in the middle of the room, like an immovable monolith. Behind the counter, Lauren's heart pounded so hard, she could hear the rush of blood in her ears. She had never seen anything like this. Rick, the man who had once been her nightmare, lay motionless on the floor, breath labored, too afraid to move. The rest of his crew was either curled up on the ground or desperately crawling away. Shaq remained still, radiating absolute calm. No arrogance, no need to yell, no need to threaten. Just his presence alone spoke volumes. It was over. And yet one question still lingered in the air. Rick was still there, his rage burning even as his body failed him. And he was not ready to accept defeat. Pain spread through Rick's body as he lay sprawled on the floor, his breath heavy. chest rising and falling with each furious inhale. But deep inside he could not accept what he was seeing. His entire crew, those ruthless men who had always crushed anyone who dared to oppose them, now lay groaning around the bar like wounded animals, their eyes glassy with fear, their former arrogance completely erased. Rage flared up inside Rick, like an uncontrollable wildfire, consuming all reason, and leaving behind nothing but raw desperation. He could not let this be the end. He could not let the town see him as a failure. He could not even allow himself to believe that someone existed who could bring him to his knees. Clenching his teeth against the pain, Rick pushed himself off the wooden floor, his legs trembling, but his determination stronger than ever. Without hesitation, his hand darted into his leather jacket pocket, fingers searching for something familiar. The cold metal of his brass knuckles met his skin, a chilling reminder that he still had one last chance. He had used them before to drop men with a single punch. His victims knew the kind of pain that came from feeling their bones crack under his fists. A faint click echoed as he tightened his grip. The brass knuckles were no longer just a weapon. They were his last hope to reclaim control. Rick's breathing steadied. His heartbeat pounded like war drums in his chest, and every step toward Shaq felt like walking a path. With no return, there was no plan. No strategy, no thoughts of consequences. All he knew was that the man in front of him had to go down no matter what. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. Then it exploded into motion as Rick lunged forward, putting every ounce of strength he had left into one devastating swing. His fist carved a deadly arc through the air, aimed straight at Shaquille O'Neal's ribs, so powerful that if it landed, it could shatter bone. But Rick had made a fatal miscalculation. His punch connected, but instead of sinking the flesh or forcing Shaq to stagger, it stopped cold as if slamming into a concrete wall. No cry of pain, no sign of impact. No reaction at all. Instead, a shock wave of force reverberated up Rick's own arm, and for a split second, he felt like he was the one who had been hit. His pupils dilated as realization sank in. Shaquille O'Neal had not even flinched. Panic ignited in Rick's chest, like dry tinder catching fire. But he could not stop now. Desperation fueled his second strike faster. Harder this time, aiming for Shaq's chest, praying that a more direct hit would change the outcome. But before the punch could land, Shaq's massive hand shot out with precise, effortless speed. His steel like fingers clamped around Rick's wrist in mid-air, stopping the strike dead in its tracks. For the first time, Rick felt completely powerless. He tried to yank his hand free. No use. He twisted, fought, struggled, but it was like being caught in a bear trap. And then, before he could process what was happening, his feet left the ground. A primal terror surged through him as gravity ceased to be his ally. The world around him blurred as Shaq twisted his body, swinging Rick like a rag doll, spinning him through the air, like a basketball about to be dunked. Pure fear flickered across Rick's face. He knew what was coming, and then with unstoppable force, Shaq slammed Rick through a table with a perfect dunk. A deafening crash tore through the bar. Wood splintered, glass shattered. Debris flew in every direction. Rick's body hit the broken remains with brutal impact, before rolling to the ground motionless. His breath ragged, eyes wide with shock. And then silence. No one dared to move, no one dared to speak. No one even dared to breathe too loudly. Behind the bar, Lauren clutched the counter. Her knuckles white, her heart pounding wildly. Her wide eyes locked onto the scene before her, unable to believe what she had just witnessed. Shaquille O'Neal still stood there. Not a drop of sweat. Not even the slightest sign of exertion. He did not need words. The message had already been delivered. Rick, the man who had ruled this town with intimidation and brute force, lay crumpled on the floor like a discarded puppet. His crew, once so eager for a fight, now cowed in stunned silence. None of them dared to move, because they all knew the truth. Facing Shaq was no longer an option. It was a death sentence. And not even Rick could deny it anymore. This fight was over. The air in the diner was still thick, with a heavy silence, broken only by the ragged breathing of the defeated men, sprawled across the wooden floor, and the faint groans echoing in the already cramped space. The scent of splintered wood, sweat, and the acrid burn from a tilted chandelier mingled into an oppressive, suffocating atmosphere. Outside, police car lights flashed red and blue, reflecting off the rain-speckled windows, accompanied by the wailing sirens, piercing through the damp night. The tension in the air solidified once more. But this time it was not out of fear of violence. It was because of the arrival of the one force that could decide the fate of everyone in this room. The door swung open. The first two officers stormed in, hands resting on their holsters, eyes scanning the room like hunters. Stepping into a battlefield, behind them followed an older man, his face lined with exhaustion and years of experience. He did not look surprised at the scene before him, but the displeasure in his gaze was clear as he took in Rick's gang, sprawled across the floor, the broken tables and the scattered injuries. His eyes landed on Rick, still slumped on the ground, and he let out a weary sigh. "You again, Rick." His voice was dry, not loud, but it carried the weight of someone who had seen this too many times before. Rick struggled, his jaw clenching, but his body was still trembling from the fall, his exhausted muscles refusing to obey him. As he tried to push himself up, attempting to salvage the last remnants of his pride, one of the officers swiftly grabbed him, twisted his arm behind his back, and the sharp click of handcuffs echoed through the unnerving silence. "You're under arrest for assault and intimidation," Rick hissed, thrashing, but the officer's grip was unyielding. He was nearly lifted off the floor as they pulled him to his feet. A tear in his leather jacket revealed bruised, battered skin underneath, evidence of Shaq's final throw. His gaze darted around, scanning the scattered remains of his gang, before locking onto Lauren. She still stood behind the counter, but she was no longer the girl he had bullied and exploited for months. She did not look away from him. She did not lower her head in fear. She stood tall, her eyes steady, as if she had finally reclaimed something she thought she had lost a long time ago. Her courage. Rick gritted his teeth, but there was nothing he could do. A soft caw broke the tense silence. From the corner of the diner, a middle-aged man in a thick trucker's jacket slowly stood. He hesitated as all eyes in the room turned to him, but his expression remained firm. In his hand was an old phone, its screen still lit. "I recorded the whole thing," he said, his voice steady, though not loud. The older officer raised an eyebrow, his sharp gaze shifting from Rick to the man holding the phone. "What do you mean?" The man swallowed, but continued, his words slow and deliberate. "They came in here looking for trouble, harassing the waitress, starting fights, and him." His eyes flicked toward Shaq. He was just defending himself. All eyes turned to Shaquille O'Neal. He stood there solid as a stone monument, neither guilty nor proud, not offering excuses nor seeking validation. His eyes that had seen too much in this world, remained calm and resolute, as if he had already known how this would end. The moment it all began, the officer was silent for a moment. Before stepping forward to take the phone, he played the video, his aged eyes scanning each frame with care. Everything was there: Rick's gang barging in, harassing Lauren, provoking a fight, throwing the first punch. Every move Shaq made was a reaction. Nothing excessive, nothing beyond what was necessary to protect himself. The officer turned off the video and quietly slipped the phone into his coat pocket. That settles it. He nodded to the officer restraining Rick. Take him and the rest of them too. The sound of handcuffs clicking filled the air, followed by the weak grumbles of the remaining gang members as they were hauled to their feet. Some tried to resist, but lacked the strength, while others had already resigned themselves to their fate. Rick was being dragged toward the door, along with his crew. But before he stepped over the threshold, he turned back, his eyes burning with hatred. You think this is over? He growled, his voice hoarse but laced with venom. I've got people, they will not let this go. Lauren shivered slightly, but she did not lower her gaze. Before Rick could say another word, Shaq stepped forward. Rick immediately fell silent. There was no threat in Shaq's eyes. No anger, no malice. Only certainty. A certainty that told Rick, if he ever came back, he would not get another chance. Rick clenched his jaw, fists clenching. But he said nothing more. The diner door swung open, then shut behind him, taking with it the rain and the flashing police lights. As they disappeared into the distance, the diner remained quiet. But this time it was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of a storm that had passed. The rain outside kept falling, each drop sliding down the fogged-up glass, while the red and blue lights from the police cars flickered in rhythm, with the night slowly reclaiming its usual silence. Inside the diner, the air still carried the echoes of the confrontation that had just taken place. Broken tables shattered, wooden debris scattered across the floor, and a faint, uneven stain of blood near the counter where Rick had fallen. But no matter how chaotic the scene was, no one could deny that something had changed forever. Rick was being dragged outside, his legs still unsteady from Shaq's final blow. He said nothing, but his silence was not a sign of submission. It was the quiet burn of a rage that had not been extinguished, smoldering like embers beneath ash yet. As he reached the doorway, he suddenly stopped, turning his head. His gaze swept across the room one last time, before locking onto Lauren's face. The silence stretched for a few seconds, but everyone in the diner could feel the cold air radiating from his stare. Not fear, but a warning. A curse, a declaration of war. From a man who was not ready to relinquish his power. You think this is over? His voice was hoarse, but brimming with menace, each word slipping out like a curse. Low, steady, carrying no need for shouting or violence, yet sharp enough to awaken an old, familiar fear in those who had lived under his rule. I've got people out there, and they will not let this slide. Lauren stiffened, her heart pounded against her ribs, and I see dread crawling up her spine, like a ghostly hand. But this time she did not lower her head. She did not take a step back. Rick saw that, and he did not like it. But before he could say another word, a shadow moved. Shaquille O'Neal stepped forward. No rush, no words. No need for theatrics, just a simple step. Yet it was a step that sealed everything. The moment Shaq moved, the room seemed to shrink, as if everything in it was being pulled toward him, toward the invisible weight he carried. The sheer pressure emanating from him smothered anything in its path. Rick felt it immediately. His breath hitched for just a second, his fingers unconsciously clenching. A part of him wanted to stand his ground, to sneer to prove he was not afraid. But instinct whispered something else. It warned him that if he uttered even one more word, things would not end here. Rick fell silent, not because he did not want to speak, but because he could not. Jack's gaze pierced through him. Not filled with hatred, not seething with rage, not even smug with victory. Just an unshakable, undeniable truth. You've lost, and if you come back, you will not walk out of here again. Rick swallowed hard, his throat dry, as if something unseen had gripped it. He took an involuntary step back, but the officer holding him paid no mind to his reaction. Without a word, the cop yanked him forward, treating him as nothing more than a pathetic, defeated man. This time Rick did not resist. The diner door swung open, and rain lashed against his face as he was shoved into the back of the police car. The door slammed shut behind him with a heavy thud, a punctuation mark to everything he once had. Inside the diner, the tension slowly unraveled, but in its place came something stranger. Relief mingled with disbelief. Lauren stood still, her breath slowing, as she tried to process whether this was truly over. The others in the diner felt the same. The people who once lowered their heads when Rick's gang walked in, who had stayed silent as violence played out in front of them, who had believed that nothing could change, were now looking at each other, as if waiting for something. And then a quiet chuckle broke the silence. Soft, subtle, yet it rippled through the room, like a pebble dropped into still water. A man near the window, probably a truck driver, shook his head with a faint smile. Well, never thought I'd see the day. Another voice chimed in, this time from a middle-aged woman, who had been sitting quietly by the counter the entire time. Me neither. And then the whispers spread, small conversations sparking throughout the diner. They were talking, they were astonished, but most importantly, they were beginning to believe that something had changed. Lauren closed her eyes, took a slow, deep breath, and then opened them again. Her gaze found Shaquille O'Neal, who was still standing there silent, watching everything unfold. She knew that without him, this would not have happened. But the question now was, had it really ended? The conversations in the diner continued, murmurs rippling through the people who had just witnessed something unprecedented. The downfall of the man who once ruled their fear. Eyes filled with astonishment, skeptical glances, and quiet laughter of relief, tinged with hesitation, as if they still could not fully believe this was real. Lauren remained behind the counter, her fingers gliding over the wooden surface, feeling the lingering tremors in her body. But this was not the fear she used to feel whenever Rick and his gang walked in number. This time, it was the feeling of something shifting deep inside. She took a slow breath, letting the air fill her lungs, feeling the warmth of the diner, the lingering scent of coffee in the air, the sound of rain outside that no longer seemed so ominous. In the past, whenever Rick's gang left, she had always felt a temporary sense of relief, but she also knew they would return, demanding more, keeping her and everyone else trapped in the cycle of fear. But tonight was different, because for the first time, she did not feel powerless. She looked down at her hands, watching as her fingers trembled slightly, before she slowly curled them into a fist. Number. She could not let this pass like a fleeting nightmare, only to slip back into the same reality. She could not let people like Rick continue to intimidate, to spread fear, simply because they thought no one dared to fight back. She made up her mind. Her voice rang out, not loud but clear, like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples across the room. I will not stay silent anymore. Conversation stilled for a moment. A few people turned to look at her, their eyes filled with surprise, but also something else, something like anticipation. She swallowed hard, but this time her voice was steadier. I'm going to press charges. For the first time in so long, she was the one saying it. No one was forcing her, no one was pushing her. This was her decision. Shaq was still standing near the counter, his eyes watching her intently, as if assessing something. A brief silence passed before he gave a slow nod, his voice low and firm, carrying the weight of someone who understood what was coming. Good, this is just the first step. Lauren took a deep breath, letting his words settle in her mind, like both a warning and an encouragement. She knew that, she understood that just because Rick was arrested, it did not mean everything was over. Rick had said he had people out there. Men like him did not give up power so easily. But this time she was not the same scared girl who used to bow her head in silence. Shaq watched her for a moment longer, before turning away, walking back to his table. He lifted his coffee cup, took a sip and said nothing more. But Lauren knew he was not the kind of man to offer empty reassurances or promise things he could not guarantee. He simply stood there being who he was. And that was enough to let her know she was not alone. A sudden thud broke the silence as someone stood up, making Lauren and a few others turn in surprise. It was the middle-aged truck driver, the man who had recorded the video, the man who had spoken up when everyone else had hesitated. He placed both hands on the table, his face serious, but there was something like respect in his eyes. You're doing the right thing. Another voice spoke up, this time from a young woman, maybe a waitress from another diner in town. We should have done this a long time ago. Here and there people started nodding, a subtle but powerful shift rippling through the room. Lauren felt her chest tighten for a moment. Not out of fear, but because of something warm. Something she had never truly felt before. For the first time, she did not feel alone. For the first time, she felt hope. Shaq looked at her and gave her the slightest smile. Lauren had changed, and so had this town. The red and blue flashes from the police car had faded beyond the window, leaving only streaks of water pooling on the asphalt, reflecting the dim glow of the street lights. In the light drizzle, the diner was still a mess. Broken tables shattered, glass scattered across the floor, but the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The people inside, after moments of shock, were slowly regaining their composure. Conversations started to ripple through the room, at first hushed murmurs, then gradually rising, growing stronger as if everyone was finally rediscovering their own voices. An older man, clearly a long-time local, pushed himself up from the table, his gaze fixed on Shaquille O'Neal, who still stood quietly near the counter, his demeanor as steady and composed as if there had never been a confrontation at all. You did not just help her, the man said, his voice rough yet firm, each word carefully measured before being spoken. You helped this whole town. A few murmurs of agreement followed. A middle-aged woman, possibly the owner of a small shop, nodded subtly, her eyes shimmering with something that resembled relief. A truck driver-looking man muttered under his breath, almost as if talking to himself, No one's ever dared to do that before. Shaq did not respond, he simply listened, letting the townsfolk piece together the meaning of what had just happened. He had not come here to be a hero, nor did he need anyone to celebrate him. He had just done what he knew was right. Lauren watched Shaq in silence for a long moment. What she saw in his eyes was not pride, nor the smug satisfaction of a man who had just won a fight, but a quiet strength, something deep, unwavering. She had never met anyone like him. Eventually she could not hold back her curiosity anymore. Why did you do it? Shaq turned to her, his expression as calm as ever, but this time there was a flicker of warmth in his gaze. He did not need to think long before answering. Because I hate seeing the strong bully the weak. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that everyone in the room could feel. It was not just something said for effect, not a phrase meant to impress or sound noble. It was a truth absolute, shaped by experience, by everything he had seen and done in his life. Lauren studied him intently, as if trying to read every layer of meaning behind his words. A man like him, possessing strength beyond question, capable of crushing anyone who stood against him, yet choosing to stand with those who could not fight for themselves. She thought about all the times Rick and his gang had walked into the diner, demanding money, making threats, forcing people to bow their heads, making her feel powerless and small. She thought about all the townspeople who had looked away, not because they wanted to, but because they did not know what else to do. Fear was the most terrifying thing in the world, because it made people believe they had no other choice but to accept. But Shaq did not accept it. And because of him, she did not want to accept it anymore either. Lauren took a deep breath. Then, without realizing it, a small smile formed on her lips. A real smile. Not the forced kind she had learned to wear over the years. Not the wary, hollow grin of someone pretending to be okay. It was the smile of a person standing at the edge of something new, realizing perhaps for the first time that she had a choice. She glanced around the diner, noticing how others were slowly reclaiming their own confidence. The nods, the quiet conversations, the way their eyes shone with something that had not been there before, like they had just woken up from a long sleep. The aftermath of the storm was not just chaos. It was not just the remnants of a fight. It was change. Something had shifted within them. And maybe within the whole town. The news about the incident at the diner spread faster than the rain that night. The video, recorded by a truck driver, was uploaded online within hours. And before long it became the hottest topic in town. Those who had once witnessed Rick's gang's reign of terror suddenly found something they never thought they would have: a voice. The ones who had been too afraid to speak the truth, the ones who had bowed their heads in silent resignation, now began to tell their stories. Tales of oppression, of forced payments, of threats whispered in dark alleyways. Stories that had once been buried in fear were finally brought into the light. The comments flooded in beneath the video. Finally someone stood up. This town has let them run wild for too long. Shaquille O'Neal did not just take down Rick. He made us realize we can fight back. Lauren read those words with a mix of relief and deep emotion. A fire had been lit, and this time it would not be easily extinguished. But no matter how much support they had, she knew the road ahead would not be easy. Rick might have been arrested, but he had been right about one thing. He still had people. Erasing his shadow from this town would not be simple. But for the first time, she did not feel alone. As the chatter continued, the diner door swung open. Shaq rose to his feet, his towering frame nearly blocking the entire doorway. He did not speak for a moment. He simply stood there quietly, taking in the space around him, the old wooden counter, the overturned chairs from the fight, the faces of people, slowly reclaiming their sense of hope. Lauren watched as he stepped toward the exit, and something in her chest tightened. She had known from the beginning that he would not stay long. He did not belong to this town, just as he did not belong to any fixed place. He was the kind of man who appeared when needed, did what had to be done, and then moved on. But before he stepped outside, he paused. He turned back, his gaze locking onto hers. A steady look, but with something else beneath it. Something like a final confirmation. The next time someone like Rick walks in, his voice was low, not loud, but it carried a weight that filled the room. You know what to do, do not you? Lauren did not hesitate. She was no longer the girl who trembled whenever the door chime rang, no longer the waitress who avoided the eyes of the men she feared, no longer the person who told herself that silence was the safest choice. She had changed. She smiled. Not a hesitant or reluctant smile, but one filled with certainty. I do. Shaq held her gaze for a second, then nodded. He did not need to say anything more. Her answer was exactly what he needed to hear. He stepped out into the night, his broad figure merging into the light drizzle outside, a man continuing down his own path, leaving behind a town that would never be the same again. Lauren stood there, watching until he disappeared into the rain, her heart filled with something she had never felt before, a certainty about who she was. The town might still have its shadows, still have people like Rick, but now it had people willing to stand up. And this time they would not stay silent. The light drizzle continued to fall, each droplet lingering on the window pane, reflecting the flickering street lights. In the night, this small town remained the same. The quiet streets, the humble shops standing side by side. But one thing had changed. The air no longer carried the fear that had clung to it for so many years. Ever since the night Rick was taken down, the police had increased their patrols. Squad cars now passed through more frequently, their flashing lights no longer a rare sight that appeared only when it was too late, but a constant reminder that this town was no longer a lawless territory, ruled by thugs. Rick's remaining crew did not dare show themselves. Right away, word had spread fast. He had been taken down by a single man, a living legend like Shaquille O'Neal himself. Those who once believed they could keep ruling with fists and violence now had to think twice. This town was no longer an easy target. And that was not just because of the police. Lauren had changed every morning. She still walked into the diner as usual, still made coffee for the regulars, still listened to the chime of the door as customers came and went. But she no longer kept her head down, no longer flinched when the door swung open, no longer glanced anxiously out the window when the sky darkened. The fear was gone, because she knew if someone like Rick ever came back, she would never stay silent again. And she was not the only one. The shop owners, the truck drivers stopping by the roadside, the people who had once resigned themselves to the way things were, they all had a reason to believe now. They no longer lowered their heads. When Rick's name was mentioned, they no longer told themselves that nothing could change. Courage is something that spreads. And that night, Shaquille O'Neal had planted a seed in this town that no one could uproot. No one knew when Shaq had left. He did not say goodbye. He did not leave a trace. He did not need anyone's thanks. One day people simply realized he was gone, like a storm wind that had passed through, shaking the foundations of everything in its wake, leaving behind a town that would never be the same. But even though he was gone, his presence remained. No one would forget the image of that towering man, standing in the diner calm, steady, fearless, in the face of the one who had terrorized the town for so long. No one would forget how he took down those thugs, not with hatred but with the sheer force of justice. And more importantly, no one would forget the lesson he left behind. Do not let fear control you. It was not just a message, it was an awakening. A town that had once trembled before the strong had now found its own strength. A girl who once felt powerless now stood tall. A group of people who once stayed silent had now found their voice. Shaquille O'Neal did not come here to change this town forever, but the town had changed because of him. And that was what truly mattered. This was not just a story about a diner showdown. It was a powerful reminder that fear only has power when we allow it to control us. Lauren chose to stand up, and because of Shaquille O'Neal's presence, the entire town reclaimed its voice. But heroes do not always appear at the right time. Sometimes we have to be the ones to stand up for ourselves and those around us. If you were in Lauren's shoes, what would you do? Would you stay silent? Or would you fight for what's right? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss more inspiring stories like this. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.